All right, Cal, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. My name is Kalwinder Dosanjh, and I've been in law enforcement with my respective department for the last 15 years. Recently transferred over from being a beat cop in the downtown east side to an investigative division. But on top of that, my main focus is also working within the community, specifically Surrey. And the demographic that I'd like to work with is youth. And so my main focus and goal is do as much as I can to keep the youth away from the lifestyle of drugs, gangs, and crime. In order to do so, I'm one of the co-founders and co-created Kids Play nonprofit organization where we utilize sports and education to keep kids away from a deconstructive lifestyle. And that organization was co-founded with Ajahn Puller, Olympian represented Canada in wrestling, and received a bronze medal. And we both noticed that there was a vortex which kids were falling into, and statistically speaking, there's a disproportionate representation of Southeast Asian youth involved in a drug and gang lifestyle. And so we essentially want to do as much as we can to assist these kids with providing resources and knowledge and opportunities and venues to keep away from that negative lifestyle. So doing all that, and on top of that, just working with the community in other aspects as well, specifically within the political realm. So there you are.
And then can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, like as to where you grew up, where you're from, where you're born?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially born and raised in Lander, a small town in South Delta, and grew up in a very traditional Sikh family. So my entire family is Amritari Sikh, so meaning baptized Sikh. And for myself as well, from a very young and early age, my mom deemed it necessary that we should also perpetuate the Sikh culture and values. And so my brother and I, we grew up in a time with Gurte where it was, we were easily racially profiled, and unfortunately stereotypes were perpetuated. And there was a lot of adversity and challenges which we had to face growing up. And so a lot of bruised knuckles, a lot of fights, and a lot of standing up for our rights. And I think that had a lot to do with forging my character in terms of who I became. Because they say that adversity essentially shapes the character that you eventually become in terms of how you face it. And it was a sink or swim mentality. Either you either got picked on, bullied, and beat up every single day, or you stood up for what you believed in and you fought back, and that's exactly what we did. So my brother and I, with the other small contingency of Indo-Canadians that used to live in Lander at that time, it was tough growing up, but I think another thing that sort of kept us away from going into a drug and gang lifestyle or becoming involved in gang activity was sports. And that's why I believe so strongly in it, because my parents were big proponents of education and sports. And so the two things that were absolutely necessary in our house, that my brother and I would go to university, regardless of whatever respective field we chose, and also to play. And so they made a point of signing us up, getting us registered, coming to our games, and I think that played a huge role with respect to who we eventually became and fueled us on.
Nice. All right, so Cal, can you just tell us a little bit about your own personal Punjabi culture? What does Punjabi Canadian mean to you, being a Punjabi Canadian?
You know, it was two dual realities I was living in that blended and fused together in just this fascinating exotic mix. Growing up, like I said, in a very traditional Sikh family, and being born and raised here, I mean, obviously this is a blend or fusion of Western meets Eastern philosophies. And so having gone to India multiple times, you see this vast diversity, the complete polarized opposites of what we're used to here in Canadian society. And so you begin to appreciate both worlds. And I think that was very important for me because it also gave me a fine balance. Because being part of the Punjabi community, Punjabi and Sikhi, these terms are very interchangeable. And for me, growing up, like I said, in that kind of environment, the Sikh core values and fundamental principles were very pervasive. And in terms of, we instilled those qualities and we embrace those attributes that are found in Sikhi, especially what we learned from all the Guru's teachings.
And did Candle kind of allow you to express that fully? Like, do you feel like Canadian society around you kind of limited that, or?
Absolutely, it did. Yeah, it did. Because I mean, keep in mind at the time, like you're going through this spiritual journey where you're trying to better understand yourself, but also understand the religion and what it has to offer. I mean, it's a very beautiful, exotic journey, magnificent with respect to the fact that you're experiencing something so surreal, so different, but it's mitigated and curtailed by the fact that you're having to deal with all this overt racism and prejudices and like blunt form of discrimination. And so you're thinking to yourself, is it all worth it? Like, I mean, having, growing up with a goatee on your head and having to fight for what you believe in, and at such a young age, like, you don't really understand those powerful internal battles that you're experiencing where you want to embrace the Sikhi, the Punjabi culture. You want to understand it and comprehend it, but at the same time, you're thinking to myself, I just want to fit in. I just want to integrate. And whether it's integration or whether it's assimilation, you really don't understand the two terms in their entirety. At that time, all you're thinking about is you just want to be a part of the larger process.
Okay, nice. So, in respect to your own Punjabi roots, your Punjabi culture, do you think it's changed from, obviously it's changed from when you were younger, right? Do you feel like your roots to Punjabi culture, Sikhi, have become stronger or weaker as you grew up in Canada?
Definitely stronger. There's no doubt about that. And the reason why I say that is because as a child, you're having these internal battles and your life is confusing as it is. Because mind you, like, think about that. As a kid, not only are you dealing with hormones and puberty and growing up and early teen years, the high school dynamic, which is tough in and of itself. But on top of that, you're having to deal with these very strong moral battles and ethical dilemmas of religion, culture. And so at that moment in time, like, there's so many variables in the equation. You're just trying to keep your head above water. But now, as you get older, you begin to have a greater magnitude of understanding the scope of your understanding. Your horizons begin to broaden, where you begin to appreciate some of the deeper concepts of Sikhi, of the culture. And
Canada's institutions, Canada's environment has allowed you to do that? Like all the Gurdwaras here, everything that's kind of adjusted in
Canada. Times have changed, and times have clearly changed. I mean, literally, like, you look around in Surrey especially, there's a Gurdwara practically in every corner, right? So within this environment, sure, things have that changed in the external environment, but internally, those battles that you used to fight, those moral and ethical dilemmas that you used to have, they no longer exist. Now it's you just want to appreciate it and understand it for what it really is. And more so than that, when you look back in retrospect, you begin to appreciate all the sacrifices and battles, not only that we had, but the ones that came before us had as well.
So ultimately, would you say that Punjabi language and culture has been lost in Canada, or would you say it's been preserved in your own accounts? So, like, for example, nowadays you see kids that don't even know how to speak Punjabi, right? Even though their parents know how to speak it fluently, right? So overall, would you say, like, in your own experience, how is language played a role in your own experiences?
You know what? It's a paradox. I'll say this much, like, it's definitely an enigma, because if you think about it, at that time, under those circumstances, extenuating circumstances, we had to fight as hard as we could to maintain our identities in terms of who we are, to preserve the culture and religion, even though at that time we didn't understand what we were doing. But now you look back and you realize we fought for what we believed in.
So even though the Canadian Multiculturalism Act was in place, you still had to fight?
Absolutely you did. I mean, because unfortunately under those circumstances, the structure or the scaffolding of the environment didn't exist, which permitted you to embrace your cultural identities, right? It was just a melting pot, right? It's not a matter of, I mean, you become part of this social, multicultural mosaic fabric, which encompasses everyone. That wasn't the case at all. Like, it was either you become assimilated and part of the larger process, or you're not. And if you're not, then basically you're ostracized and alienated. And this is the paradox that I'm referring to, is that considering all the battles that we fought, finally, now we're getting the recognition we deserve in terms of language and culture, and people are openly exercising their religion out there. But now, you're seeing a larger demographic of Southeast Asian youth who don't even understand the language. And I mean, let alone going to a gurdwara, that would be a foreign experience to them. And considering that the environment is more conducive to facilitating learning in that environment, or learning the language and learning the culture, and still they don't want to embrace it. But in that time, when it was harder to do that, we were fighting for it. So it hurts in that respect. That you would hope that everything that our ancestors fought for, or we fought for that matter, that it be relatively preserved. And it is preserved. It's preserved by the fact that we're literally seeing all these gurdwara and a greater influx of immigration coming from India as well, and more people that are here speaking Punjabi. But it's being lost amongst our new generation of kids to some degree.
Nicely put. So one last comment on this section. What do you think, what do you say to these youth, or what do you say to these future generations? Do you think they should maintain their culture? Like, obviously, right? And if so, how do you think they should go as to do it? Like, what is your advice for future generations or future kids on how they should maintain their own culture?
Cultural diversity is something that is part of their household. It's part and parcel of their identity of who they are. When you grow up in a Southeast Asian household, no matter how westernized it is, I mean, it's always going to be some relics and they're reminiscent of the religion, of the culture, which get passed on from one generation to the next. So it's never lost, but an effort has to be made to at least make an effort to preserve.
So it's more of an individual effort than Canada's effort. Would you say that?
Absolutely, it would. Right? I mean, because the thing is, Canada has given the opportunity. And so Canada, based on all the policies and all the laws that are out there, it openly supports maintaining your cultural identity. And so this is, if you look at globally what's going on right now, this is a huge paradigm shift to what's permitted in some other war-torn countries right now, where you are forced to abide by a very strict set of rules and principles, where you might not necessarily have the opportunity to practice your religion or observe or exercise your beliefs. But here that opportunity exists, and because it exists, right, it's almost taken for granted. And when it's taken for granted, then people just think to themselves that it doesn't carry any value. Right?
Nicely put. Alright, so Cal, ever since the 80s, do you think that Punjabi people have kind of had equal access to social resources such as education or employment? Or do you think there's been evident barriers? Can you think of any instances?
For the longest time, I mean, there's no doubt about it in my mind that if you took a look at some of the major corporations or even government agencies, there's always been this underlying systemic discrimination, where unfortunately with Canadian society, maybe on account of political correctness, it was very subtle, it was very under the radar, but it existed, there's no doubt about that. I mean, you would see examples of that all the time. Times have changed though, and I mean, versus having this ostensible two-tier process where one tier was for white mainstream conservative society and the other tier was for immigrants who were minorities in this community. Clearly there was these two parallels that existed. And so these double standards, I mean, they have changed significantly over time, where, like I said, I mean, with Canadian policies, regulations, and with people just becoming generally more educated, you're seeing...
So what about yourself? Can you think of how you've kind of broken down these barriers by how Punjabi people have broken down these barriers by using the example of policing? Like, obviously we had the issue of the turban before in policing, and then we had the issue, there weren't obviously that many Punjabi people in policing before the Multiculturalism Act than there is now, right?
Absolutely. I mean, back in the day, if you think about it, like they say, police. Robert Peel, one of his principles, and he's one of the founding fathers of modern day policing. He said the police is the public, and the public is the police. Well, how can that be true when the majority of the police force would be white, policing communities where some of the demographics were, open, visible minority populations? And so the thing is, there's no way they could understand the culture, the nuances, the idiosyncrasies of that community. And so that's why with the arrival of Baltej Dillon, who was the first Sikh police officer in the RCMP, that was huge. I mean, that was just this monumental shift with respect to perceptions and belief systems in the police departments, and that essentially blazed the trail for a lot of visible minorities to come into policing.
Would you say that also allowed kind of you to come into policing? That served as kind of a spark?
Well, I remember seeing that when I was growing up, and it was admirable, and I found that very inspirational. Where my goal was never to go into policing; it was to go to law school. And so when I was going through university, my first 2 or 3 years, I mean, that's what I was focused on. Like I had just this one-dimensional viewpoint. Well, that's all I'm going to do. I just want to get into law. And I was very myopic in that respect. But just realized my true calling was policing, just through life circumstances. And so when I did get into policing, a large contributing factor of that was watching Baltej Dillon become an officer. And so when I would see other police officers who were also visible minorities, that was also inspiration, because it just made me want to do it that much more.
And the institutions put forth in the 80s kind of allowed for that, right?
Later on.
Later on?
Later on. I think, like I said, even the early 80s were a reflection of the 70s and the 60s, where there was still that vestige of backwards thinking. And later on in the 80s, you gradually began to see this paradigm shift in thinking process, and just this gradual evolution with respect to policing, but transformation of society in general.
So what about your own policing career? Like, how would you say, like, being a Punjabi, you've kind of incorporated that into the VPD. How would you say that you've incorporated your Punjabi culture within the sphere of policing? How do you think Punjabi people overall, besides Baltej Dillon, the influx of Punjabi people, how have they changed policing in Canada?
Well, I mean, just take a look at this. Like, on average, at home, in my personal life, I'm getting about 3-4 phone calls from parents because they know I'm a police officer and they don't have the English proficiency skills. And so they talk to me in Punjabi and they ask about some insights, knowledge, resources, which I can provide them with respect to how they can get their kids out of drugs and gangs, because their kids have become entrenched into that lifestyle. And so they would never have reached out had it just been white police officers who can't speak Punjabi, because there always would have been that disconnect, that language barrier, and also that misunderstanding that just goes between cultures, right? So at least with me, I understand where they're coming from, what their situation is, and I do provide them the help to get their kids out of that lifestyle.
So in respect to that, when you're policing, right, obviously there's a huge South Asian demographic here, right? And there's people that police that region, right? Would you say that Punjabi people are treated equally under the law?
Yeah, I would. Absolutely, I would. And because any sworn police officer who enters the realm of policing, I mean, the first thing that you're taught is it is extremely, extremely critical just maintaining that and preserving the public trust to show an air of objectivity. And so any situation that we deal with, visible minority or not, everybody needs to be treated equally regardless of their socioeconomic status or their visible minority status.
Okay, and then taking back into respect with the Punjabi people involved in gangs and violence, right? Would you have to say that a lot of the Punjabi people, the second generation that are involved in that kind of in those kind of things, right? Do you think it stems off for kind of like immigrant parents who have been denied access to social resources such as employment? Like, for example, let's just say an immigrant parent was a lawyer in India, but had the credentials, but was blocked that opportunity here. Do you think, and then instead he had to work long hours, do you think that plays a part in kind of perpetuating that cycle?
No, 1,000,000%. I mean, in the fundamental theory in psychology is nature versus nurture. Right? I mean, genetic disposition obviously has has something to do with who you eventually become, but the majority of who you become is primarily accountable to your environment. And so, if you take a look at these professionals that come over, that immigrate over to Canada from these other countries, case in point India, and they were well-to-do there. They had all the resources, the amenities, and they were living a good, modern lifestyle where they could provide their families thoroughly. And then all of a sudden to shift from that, having everything, to literally having nothing in the new country and to having to start all over again. Meaning, whereas in India, they could have spent more time with their kids, provided them with the resources that they needed, educationally speaking, to advance in society. But here, they're so entrenched with respect to making a living, and they might be working multiple jobs, that they cannot allocate enough time for their kids. And a lot of the kids that I see end up going to the drug and gang lifestyle are primarily unaccounted. There's no supervision or monitoring at home. Both parents are working, and they're out trying to make a living and become financially stable in this new country.
This is kind of a result of a systemic barrier, right?
Very much so. And so the Canadian government, I guess in all its wisdom, they've decided that unfortunately a lot of the credentials that come from these third world countries cannot be recognized. And with these families that come over, they have to go through a very laboring, very protracted process in order to get the credentials they need so that they can start practicing their respective profession again. A lot of these individuals don't have the time. They're trying to make a living. They're trying to survive. So it's raw, visceral, fundamental human condition. And so that never gets accounted for. That never gets quantified. And
it's more, the blame is put more so on the second generation that, oh, they're a gang, they're a gangster or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. This is who they were meant to become. Right? And then
they don't look at that stemming background of it, right?
They don't look at the bigger issues that resulted in these individuals being spawned, or the circumstances.
Have you seen this in your own experiences? Like, does this kind of come up as an issue, or is this just...
Oh, I'm the perfect example of that. Where, I mean, my parents immigrated in the late...
Just give me 1 second, sorry.
Yeah, as I was saying, I'm the perfect example of that, where in the late 70s, early 80s, my parents had immigrated to Canada. I should say early 70s and towards the early 80s. So during that time period, I mean, there was a lot of upheaval and a lot of families that were struggling to financially stabilize themselves and establish a foothold in this society. And so on account of that, I mean, my parents were working double shifts just so that they could make a living and give my brother and I all the amenities that we needed to succeed. It was a very difficult time. And I remember my grandparents being here and us being raised primarily under their supervision and care. It would have been very easy for my brother and I to go into that drug and gang lifestyle had we chosen to pursue it, because there was really no monitoring or supervision at home. Our grandparents were too old, and we could easily have made excuses and taken off. And so the biggest thing there was that my mom and dad had a very strong presence in our lives. Even though they were working double shifts, even so we didn't see a lot of them in our early development years. They always made a point of sitting down and talking to us, which I thought was absolutely huge. Where had they not done that, had there not been that rapport or communication bridge, I think we would have easily been lost to this negative lifestyle. So, I mean, we are the survivors, and I'm talking about myself as a positive example of somebody that made it out, so to speak. But there was a million other examples out there that didn't.
And you know them personally?
I saw a lot of individuals. I saw a lot of kids that ended up going into that negative lifestyle because they didn't have that supervision at home. And that's where you sort of part ways with them at a very early age, and you realize what you need to do in life and who you need to become, and you can't let them pull you down with them.
Alright, Kel. So, like overall, when you were growing up, like ultimately, do you consider yourself an Indo-Canadian or a Canadian?
It's not so much what I considered myself when I was growing up. It was the labeling which identified me when I was a kid, where it was made quite clear to me that I was an outsider. And so over time you begin to sort of, unfortunately, a lot of that begins to become entrenched into your thinking processes, where you're continuously reminded that you're not a part of the general broader community. But I mean, obviously, with, like I said, with greater education and with increased knowledge, and as the environment changed, so did the public perceptions, and you saw a lot greater significant reduction in negative public perceptions and stereotypes. And so on account of that, later on in life, you obviously begin to see more and more yourself as part of the greater community, greater Canadian community, and you are a Canadian. And that's how I always perceived myself, is that regardless of the adverse circumstances that I had to face, I never allowed it to twist or distort my perception of who I really was, and that is Canadian. So my personal governing philosophy and set of principles was that, I'm just like everybody else, and I participated in all the activities and everything else that any other Canadian kid would do.
So, like, in respect to like all growing up in Ladner and all that, right? Obviously, you faced instances of discrimination and racism, right? How did that play a part in your kind of understanding of who you were?
Well, like I said before, I think it's important to reiterate that character is forged with respect to how you handle adversity. And for me, I think in the process of growing up under those adverse circumstances, it mitigated a lot of your childhood, where the majority of your time wasn't spent in trying to establish your personal identity or go through a personal developmental growth. I think more and more time is spent in just trying to fight off these type of perceptions and try to stand.
So what were those kind of perceptions? Can you just elaborate on that?
Like I said, I mean, we were always treated as foreigners and always treated as an outsider. And so for us, I mean, it was just a matter of fighting back, literally speaking, and trying to make our way in this world and sort of try to transform other people's perceptions at the same time. But like I said, it was a very difficult process, but it made us who we are.
So overall, like when you were like growing up, you probably learned about the Multiculturalism Act, right? In school, right? You probably have some awareness of what it was, what it entails, right? Mm-hmm. Do you ultimately feel, since that act was established, that it kind of helped Punjabi people, like it kind of helped Punjabi people alleviate that inner conflict, or do you think it just added to it?
Policy, laws, and regulations are respectively innocuous and papier-mâché tigers unless they are put into use, unless you give them claws and fangs. And so with this policy, I mean, case in point, look at the Criminal Code of Canada. Those are laws which everyone is supposed to abide by. Do they? No. Well, why are we still arresting people every single day? Because laws are meant to be broken, and these individuals don't respect those laws. And so same thing, I mean, with respect to multicultural policies, sure the policies were there. Sure the policies were enshrined in our constitutional framework. Were they exercised or observed all the time? No, absolutely not.
And that led to your inner conflict, would you say?
Inner and outer conflict. I mean, with respect to inner conflict, like I said, for my brother and I, it was just all a matter of fitting in. It wasn't even a matter of establishing our own identity so we could be recognized for who we are. I mean, there came a point where it just wasn't a matter of integrating into broader society and just being, like I said, recognized as a youth in a traditional Sikh family. It was more just being part of that melting pot where you just want to be assimilated in the greater process and not be ousted, not be alienated, not be bullied in that respect. So, like I said, it played a huge role in who we became, and unfortunately those were turbulent times, and we had to face a lot of trials and tribulations. But on account of that, I think that was very conducive to facilitating who we eventually became.
So as to that point, like as to who we became, what do you think we've become? How do you think that Canadian society perceives Punjabi people in Canada? Based on your own experiences.
It did two things. I think number one, it blazed the trail for other youth to make it an easier path for them to become professionals within the Canadian framework of society and establish themselves on equal footing. And so you look at any profession these days, whether it's the law profession, whether it's policing, whether it's the medical profession, there's Indians that are part of that profession. Right? So you'll notice them predominantly in all these respective backgrounds.
So with that influx, do you think our overall image is tending to become more positive than it was before?
Absolutely it is. I mean, the more and more these individuals become professionals in their respective environments, obviously the more that respect is going to go up because they realize we're a critical component of the broader machinery. But the second thing it also did is that I think all the sacrifices that were made, case in point, in the Kamagata Maru, or along the way, all the battles and the scuffles that we had to face along the way, I think the culmination of that effect was that you can say it reached a terminal velocity where it forced us to come out of our shells and evolve and transform into more of these predominant figures as a more predominant community.
So in regards to those prominent figures, do you believe that there are obviously prominent figures in policing, education, etc.? Do you think, do you see those prominent figures increasing or decreasing as times change? In respect to those prominent figures, can you tell us a little bit about who you perceive as prominent figures?
I think Wally Opal's a perfect example of that. All the adversity that Wally had to face, I mean, he made it through. Mo Sahura and Baltej Tilan. Like, these are strong, inspirational figures in the Southeast Asian community. And what makes them so strong is I don't think their battles were any different from Nelson Mandela, where, I mean, I'm not by any means trying to draw a metaphorical equivalent to apartheid or what Nelson Mandela had to face. But at the same time, yeah, within our respective context, these were battles that Wally, Mo, and Baltej had to fight and blaze the trail for the rest of us.
So, with that in consideration, this is a really broad question, but do you ever see a future Punjabi Prime Minister in Canada?
I do. Very much I do. The more and more, in that specific context of politics, the more and more I see Indo-Canadians becoming MPs or MLAs, especially in cabinet positions, high-ranking cabinet positions. Why not? The next chapter of this, definitely I can see that happening.
Nice. So, Cal, growing up, how did you learn the language of Punjabi?
There's some funny stories behind that. But My mom and dad made it a point of speaking Punjabi to us in the household all the time, but they also put us in Punjabi school. And so I remember my brother and I, every Wednesday and Saturday night, we used to be in Punjabi school at Ross Street Sikh Temple. And I remember it was this very small classroom where it was just this very dusky, damp type of environment where we grew up, and it was a teacher who made it a point of making sure that the students were there to learn. So a lot of chalk being thrown across the classroom at sleepy individuals. So yeah, I mean, it was interesting growing up in that kind of environment where you're learning the Punjabi language and you're thinking to yourself, I mean, I speak it at home anyways. I mean, why do I need to learn it? But later on in life, you begin to look back in retrospect and you realize, I'm glad my mom and dad did that. Because
and do you think like today Canadian society that you're placed in allows you to fulfill that language you learned in the past?
Well, I think you made it a point earlier where you're seeing that language lost in the new generation of kids, because here, English being the primary and dominant language, which is spoken in schools, law professions, everywhere else. I mean, the only time you'll really be speaking Punjabi is in your household and to your parents. So, I mean, does it play that large of a role? Not really, because now you're looking at second, third, fourth generation Indo-Canadian families.
So do you think
gradually the language dissipated over time?
So what about your own kids? Do they know how to speak Punjabi?
Absolutely they do.
And what have you done to ensure that they learn Punjabi, that Punjabi stays with them? And why do you feel like it's important?
First and foremost, I married in India. So my wife speaks Punjabi and my parents speak Punjabi. So Punjabi is spoken in the house, with the exception of me. I'll be honest, I speak English to the kids. But they learn Punjabi in school. And I make sure of taking them to the Gurdwara as well, so they understand what our culture is all about and what our religion's all about.
Nice. All right, thank you, Kel.
Okay.